Greetings, viewers. This is just a little overview for Chapter 2 in my text, The Third Supercycle. And this covers how World War I is fought, how it's actually prosecuted, and why the Entente has to win a victory against the Central Powers. Now, the simple version of this story is simply one of resources, but there's actually a more complex story in that simple story. Now, the simple story is that the Central Powers are 10% of the world by population, and they generate about 15 to 17% of the world economy, around a seventh or so. However, the Entente has 50% of the world population and close to 2/3 of the world economy at its disposal. So the Central Powers are out-soldiered and out-mechanized and out-produced by 4 or 5 to 1. Okay, so there is reason number one, just the sheer scale of resources. There's no way for the Central Powers to offset this massive imbalance in material. But the problem is worse than just an imbalance of material, because sometimes material can be overcome with quality. The Entente had qualitatively superior strategies of war fighting. So the Central Powers, the three main ones, were the German Empire, the Austrian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, the three most powerful armies. And they all had strategies that all the semi-peripheries used, and that was basically what you could call railroad and demographic mobilization. So very simple. You just round up as many young males as you can, you give them a rifle, you put them on a train, send them to the front line, and hope to achieve victory. Of course, the result was bloody trench war and attrition, so it didn't work. The more industrialized core polities, and of course 4 of these core polities, Belgium, Britain, France, and the United States, they choose to fight the war in a very different way because they have more industry, they have technology, they have finance. So they basically adopt the strategy of relying more on technology and capital and less on soldiers, per se. They do mobilize mass armies, but they equip them and train them differently. The best way of explaining the difference is the core polities are using a strategy of maritime and fiscal mobilization. Now, the fiscal side is very easy to explain, and it's just state spending. These are self-financing economies, and so they're able to issue lots of long-term debt to pay for their war. None of the semi-peripheries can do that. They're reliant upon the core for money. Both Italy and the Roman Empire, they fight with the Entente, but only because the Entente is sending them huge amounts of help in the form of foreign loans and equipment and supplies. The Central Powers, they're all semi-peripheries, they don't have the capacity to mobilize the state. They can mobilize people, but they don't have the wherewithal to match that strategy. And so they're not able to match it at all. This is why they're doomed to defeat. The other side of the story, the maritime strategy of the core polities, this is also important to understand. The Entente had a monopoly on world trade, and that had 2 effects on the course of the war. Number one, by cutting off the Central Powers from world trade, it imploded the Central Powers' agricultural sector, which was heavily dependent upon imports of fertilizer, markets, and so forth. So there's a massive economic contraction in the Central Powers during the war, whereas the core polities, their economies expanded during the war because of state spending. So this is one part of the maritime story. The other part of the maritime story is the Entente is able to move large numbers of people around the world system to plug the gaps because it's sending large amounts of soldiers to the front line. So you might think they would damage production, no one is in the factory. Unless you mobilize people from the semi-periphery and periphery, but also mobilize women, and that's what they did. The Entente mobilizes, historians have calculated, about 3.6 million soldiers and laborers from the colonial and neo-colonial peripheries of Africa and Asia. A good example here is workers from China. 140,000 workers from China actually worked on the Western Front as laborers, so making up for all the young males that were drafted and sent into the war. We think roughly 500,000 worked in the Romanov Empire in the Far East, Siberia, and so forth, performing a similar function, as the Romanov Empire was part of the Entente. Okay. The Entente also mobilized 1.7 million women into the workforce. And when you add these 2 numbers together, you get an additional labor pool of about 5.3 million individuals. And this offsets the roughly 5 to 6 million that are sent off to become soldiers. So Entente is able to mobilize and just keep on expanding its economy. The Central Powers cannot do this at all. When they take soldiers to the front line, that means that they don't have production in their factories anymore. So there's no way they can keep up with the Entente. Last thing to mention about the course of the war, one of the things that happens in the war, because the Central Powers quickly realize it's a battle of attrition and they're casting around for solutions. They're trying to find solutions to this insoluble problem. So what they do is a range of tactical innovations. And they try to use these innovations to answer for the fact that they don't have the resources that the Entente has. They try to just use trickery and cunning and tricks in lieu of resources. And this is sort of a prelude to of course, the Axis strategies of World War II would actually end up in the same place, trying to use, wonder weapons and other ideological delusions in place of actual material resources. Well, the Central Power version of this dilemma is a set of tactical innovations, which did change the battlefield, but the Entente would always respond with their own counters in due time. The great example is poison gas. Poison gas artillery that's first used by the Central Powers, and they gain a little territory, but the Entente learn, and they figure out what it is, and they issue gas masks to their soldiers, and they also come up with their own poison gas production lines, and so the advantage goes away. Neither side has an advantage anymore. The Central Powers deploy submarines to effect, first of all. The Entente counters with submarine hunting missions and convoys and sonar and other technologies to sink the submarines and neutralize that. The Central Powers at one point in 1916 actually had a brief moment of air superiority because they invested in new planes and pilots and so forth. The Entente countered once again and came up with better planes and production and trained a lot of new pilots and won control of the air again. The last innovation was the Central Powers came up with small unit attrition tactics, the so-called stormtrooper tactic of late 1917, early 19, and they used this in their offensives, the final offensives in March and April of 1918. The idea was you trained small groups of soldiers to go after specific targets, and you tried to counter the materiel that the Entente have with just superior tactical skill at the local level. And the problem with that is the Entente counters, and they come up with their own small unit tactics and their own strategies and counter that, and then neither side has the advantage anymore. So what does tip the balance? Well, first of all, of course, that immense material superiority, but also the fact that by 1918, the Entente comes up with a new way of fighting war, and that is combined arms operation. The best single paragraph on this was written by a very fine historian, Dennis Showalter, who wrote a book worth reading, Instrument of War, The German Army, 1914-1918. So I'm just going to quote from that text, and here's what he says, quote, "It is more accurate to credit the empirical British with developing the first modern combined arms team, a doctrinal, institutional, and technological synergy among infantry, artillery, tanks, and air power, coordinated by radio systems. The artillery sealed the flanks of an attack, conducted counter-battery fire against German gun positions, and provided initial creeping barrage. Within the artillery zone, the tanks sought targets of opportunity, while the infantry probed for soft spots, each supporting the other as needed. Aircraft provided reconnaissance, artillery observation, and increasingly ground support. By August 1918, the Tank Corps had a Royal Air Force squadron attached." Unquote. So this is the recognizable blueprint for all future combined arms tactics. These tactics would be used to great effect in the so-called 100 Days Offensive, which ends the war, which implodes the German army positions on the Western Front, and then the German army cannot fight anymore, it's being defeated. One small statistic to give you a sense of the imbalance by the end of the war. In the course of the war, the Entente deployed over 8,000 tanks. The Central Powers were never able to deploy more than 20 tanks. Not making this up. 8,000 versus 20. That was the imbalance by the end. So there's no way for the Central Powers to win this. They had lost the war, and what happened, ceasefire, the armistice, happens in 1918, and then the political fallout of the lost war happens. And what happens is that there are political consequences to losing a world war. And some of the biggest empires in the world start to implode or self-destruct or disintegrate in 1918 and thereafter. And that's a story for the next chapter, chapter 3. So I'll stop here.